Hello, kippers and stingrays. Ranger Bill here again. So for the final story within the Witch of Pungo, I chose to come here to First Landing State Park. As a child, it was Seashore State Park, and sit among the sand dunes on the bay, and where the bay meets the ocean here at Cape Henry. The story, Little Ella and the Windmill, actually takes place at Dam Neck, which was at the south end of Virginia Beach, south of the resort area. And that's now a naval complex. And among many of the tenant commands like Fleet Combat Training Center Atlantic, where I once worked, and the Navy Marine Corps Intelligence Training Center, also resides the Navy Special Warfare Development Group, aka Dev Group. So the filming of anything there is discouraged, and rather than cause any trouble, I decided to just come back here in the quiet of the sand dunes on the bay and read to you. So, the final story within the Witch of Pungo, Little Ella and the Windmill. All morning, Little Ella had waited. It seemed to her that noon and dinner time would never come. She wanted her father to stop plowing so they could go to Dam Neck to her grandfather's mill. She had climbed a tree so she could watch her father at his work. The rows of corn had grown so tall that old Joe, the mule, could hardly be seen above the corn tassels. On his head was a funny straw hat with holes cut so that his long ears could stick out. The field corn smelled sweet in the hot July sun. Little Ella could see in the distance the house where she lived. There was a kitchen in the yard where Mother was cooking dinner. Smoke came out of the kitchen chimney, for the fire in the big cook stove was never allowed to go entirely out, even in the summer. There was always something cooking. There was a canning of vegetables from the garden to be put away for winter. Her small brothers could be seen playing in the swing, which hung from a big limb on the walnut tree. Little Ella climbed down and stood in the sun. She knew if there was no long shadow of herself on the ground and her head and feet seemed to meet, the sundial she had made for herself, or of herself, would mean that it was 12 o'clock noon. That meant time to eat her midday dinner. She looked up and saw that her father had finished plowing. She skipped along, singing for joy as she followed the mule to the wooden water trough by the well, where he would have a long, cool drink before he was put into the stable to rest. Later, he would be hitched to the tall, two-headed beach cart in which Little Ella and her father would journey to the ocean. All during the dinner, Mother was giving instructions about what the little girl was to do while she was on the visit to her grandparents. Now, Little Ella, don't go out above your knees when you go into the bathing. And don't wander off in the swamp and get lost, cautioned her mother. Be sure to look out for snakes, for they like the sun themselves on the dam. At the word snake, the two little brothers began to show interest in the trip and seemed to realize for the first time that their sister was going to visit their grandparents. Can we go too? They asked. When you are older, was the reply. But they followed their father to the stable and watched him hitch the mule and put the snacks of wheat and rye that were to be ground into the cart. Mother had tied her little girl's clothes in a bright red shawl and had made her daughter put on her sunbonnet to keep her from getting freckles on her nose. Then little Ella hugged her brothers and kissed her mother goodbye, and her father lifted her up to the seat of the tall cart. With a crack of the whip, the wheels of the cart began to turn, and they were off on their trip. Old Joe, the mule, had made the trip to the mill many times. He went off along the road that went by the other farms. The sun was hot until the road entered the tall pine forest. Here the cart bounced in the ruts, and there was so much to see. Squirrels scampered in the trees. A flash of white was the tail of a deer as they ran at the sound of their voices. Birds sang and little Ella hummed a tune herself because she was so happy. After several miles, the road came out of the woods, and there was a covered bridge over the wide creek. The child loved the echo of the mule's hooves on the wooden planks of the bridge. It was cool and dark inside. Her father stopped the cart, and after they crossed to the other side of the creek, and they looked at the beautiful yellow lotus that seemed to stretch for miles in the creek, there were other water lilies, tall cattails growing from the rushes. Her father pointed out an osprey nest in the tall dead cypress tree. They watched the great blue heron wade across the shore looking for a frog to eat. The bird circling high overhead was an eagle. The bluish bird that flew from a pine tree and dived into the water was a kingfisher looking for his dinner. As they continued their journey, they saw dark cypress lagoons beside the road where the trees were hung with gray moss. This same moss was used to fill the mattresses on little Ella's bed that she slept in the summer. It was much cooler than the feather mattress used to keep her warm in the winter. As they rode along, she asked her father to tell her a story about Dam Neck, where he lived as a boy. Her father's story, his favorite story, was about the time the windmill caught on fire and burned up. Little Ella never grew tired of exciting stories of her father's boyhood. Well, the story began, I was 9 years old, just the age you are now. It was a hot summer day like today, and my father had a lot of leftover grain to be ground. So both mills were to be run. Your grandfather was to run one mill, my uncle the other. There was a strong breeze, and after the sails had been unfurled, the mills were turning fast. I was helping my father pour the grain from the sacks so that it would feed between the millstones. The mill house was shaking, and we had to work fast. Suddenly, it began to get dark, and we saw that a big black storm have covered the sun. My father stopped his mill, put the brake on, and rolled a great stone against it so that the sails were firmly stopped. Then we rolled up the cloth sails. Uncle Jim, who was operating the other mill, loved adventure, so he kept his mill going, even though there were flashes of lightning and the thunder had begun to roll. All at once we heard Uncle Jim yell, "Help! Help! The brake won't hold, Father!" And I ran towards the mill, but it was too late. A strong wind from the storm had caused the mill to run away, and sparks from the millstones had caught the mill house on fire. We saw my uncle come running down the tall steps that led up to the mill house. The rain began to fall, and we ran to the shelter of our house. There was a terrible crash of lightning as lightning struck the burning mill. The mill house and the stones fell to the ground, but because the wind blew the sparks towards the ocean and the rain had soaked the roof, my grandfather's mill was saved. That is my favorite story, said little Ella. Now tell me about the shipwreck, please. There will not be time for another story, but if you listen, you will soon hear the waves. I can hear a hovercraft coming across the waves out there. The great sand dune. There was no longer a road, but old Joe knew the way and had to pull very hard through the soft sand to reach the top of the dune with the cart. Do you see what I see? Said Father as he stepped to the ground to let the tired mule rest. Up the beach was her grandfather's house, the little chapel by the sea, and the windmill, with its great sails turning in the breeze. The air felt cooler as it blew off the ocean, and her father smiled as he said, "There is such a good breeze, I can get my grain ground today." Does that mean that I can stay longer at the beach? Yes, answered her father. If you will help your grandmother gather the eggs and feed the chickens and learn your Bible verse every day, I will not come back for you until I bring the minister to hold services at the chapel, and that will be 2 weeks. Little Ella bounced up and down in the cart, and she was so happy. And old Joe seemed to feel younger too. The wet sand near the waves was cool and hard to his tired hooves. The wheels of the cart turned rapidly, and the mule trotted fast. There was a lot to see from a high seat in the cart. Little Ella watched a big sailing vessel out in the ocean, the gulls flying over the waves. As they drew near the mill, the sails stopped turning. This meant her grandfather had seen them and was putting the brake on the mill. Her father led her out of the cart at the foot of the tall steps that led up to the mill house. It always scared Ella to climb those shaky steps, but her grandfather was on the porch of the mill house waiting to give her a big hug and to carry her down the steps on his back. And there was grandmother, waiting to greet her when she got down. When little Ella was no longer little, but grown up and married, she loved to tell her own little girls about the visits she made as a child to the Windmills at Dam Neck. So, a nice story of a beautiful area and a time when windmills were important to survival and commerce and part of the farming process. Historical background, like all these stories, it's based on true areas, true places, and so I'll read that to you again. Little Ella and the Windmill, historical background. In the early days, when the English began to colonize Tidewater, Virginia, they realized there were no flowing streams and rivers that would turn a mill to grind the grain that was so necessary to keep them from starving. So they brought over from Holland and England men who could build post-type mills. It was possible for the mill houses to rotate so that the sails could be facing the prevailing wind. There were many of these mills in the area now known as Virginia Beach. Some of them were in the operation as late as 1910. At Dam Neck, there were two windmills. In colonial Williamsburg today, there is a restored mill of this type. In these mills were large stones and the grain was ground between them. When the first mills were built in Virginia, Indians had not left the area. They watched with awe as the cloth sails were unfurled. When the sails of the mill began to turn, they made a loud noise, and the Indians were terrified and fled to the forest for safety. When they were shown the ground grain, they believed an evil spirit lived in the mill, and he ground the grain with his teeth. Operating a windmill was a dangerous job. There was always a threat that when the mill was in operation, a sudden storm would cause the wind to increase and make the brake on the mill useless. Then the mill would run away. The only thing that the miller could do when that happened was to keep pouring on more grain or leave the mill and pray that sparks from the stones would not cause the mill house to catch fire. Little Ella of the story was a child born shortly after the Civil War near Nemo Church in Princess Anne County. When she was a very old lady, she told of her trips to the windmills at Dam Neck when she was a child and personally described the mills. The yellow lotus that little Ella saw still grows in a creek near Sand Bridge. This lotus was at one time a common sight in the rivers of America. The Indians used every part of the plant for food. The early green leaves were cooked. When there was ice on the streams in the winter, the seeds of the plant were gathered and cooked like beans. The roots were baked as a potato. There is Lotus Festival held in Virginia Beach each summer to help preserve the rare plant. The end. And one final image of Ella and her father heading out to the mills. Well, that wraps up the Witch of Pungo. It was an amazing inspiration to me as a child to get out and explore the world around me and the stories and the people and feel connected with it all. And I've carried that with me throughout my entire life. You know, I subjected my own children to it, and now I subjected y'all to it. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed your spring break. I liked getting out and re-energizing, reconnecting, and learning. And I look forward to seeing you guys again soon and doing some pretty cool stuff together. Get out and enjoy yourselves within reason. And